So it's clear from public discourse over the past week that people hate Madame Web, and I'm using that term hate as some are even calling it one of the worst superhero films of all time. For me, it looks somewhat interesting from what I heard before the first trailer sort of sank those hopes for a quality film. I knew that the film would be bad based on feedback from the trailer alone, especially once reviews were released, and it is. However, what has bugged me a lot about the content of Madame Web reviews is that the majority just cover the same general topics of why the film is bad, with little to no expansion on these points, as if they know their audience knows the film is bad as well and therefore just agrees. Now, I don't want to hate on anyone reviewing the film as it's their subjective opinions and they should be respected, yet when the content of each review is so similar to one another, it just dilutes the conversation regarding the quality of Madame Web, and that's why I'm making this video. As well as going more in depth into the faults, I do want to highlight parts of the film that are positive. Yeah, that's right, Madame Web has aspects to it that actually do work. You'd never believe that coming from most other reviewers, but it's true. Then afterwards, I also want to talk about how I'd fix the film, as I got a lot of ideas that could give it the suspense and intrigue one would expect from the concepts at play. Also, quick note, you'll have probably noticed by now, but yeah, I'm leaving the video to be just a thumbnail, so the points in general discussion are the primary parts that are taken from this. Also, it means minimal editing, so bonus. So without further ado, let's get into Madame Web. With what I'm discussing here, I expect that you all have probably seen Madame Web, so I'm just going to skip over any sort of plot synopsis, also spoiler warnings. Our protagonist of Madame Web is Cassandra Webb, played by Dakota Johnson. She's an insincere paramedic that develops psychic abilities after almost drowning. I'm just going to cut to the chase, Cassie is such an unlikable character. To start, Johnson never sells the role, period. Her speech is often monotone with little emotion present in her actions or how she interacts with others. It isn't too noticeable in the first half of the film, and some might say that a lack of emotion is so that the audience can be a conduit for what happens in the film. I don't see this approach, as with the writing it's clear that they're attempting to make Cassie a tragic and relatable person. Unfortunately, the mix of lackluster writing and stilted acting means that we never really see that aspect of her come to fruition. And it gets worse when Cassie meets up with the girls. I'll discuss their names later on, but the film in general has a lack of care regarding their characters, period, so don't expect me to care as well. She's just straight up irresponsible and makes decisions that no adult would make. For instance, after taking them to a secluded forest, she just straight up leaves for hours to look into a briefcase of past mementos to uncover if there are any links, meaning the girls are just left in a forest with no supplies. Where was the rational thinking in that? And by the end of the film, when she's seen as a mother figure to these girls, it just takes the cake up for how stupid the writers think the audience is for buying that shit. When a character's constantly being half-assed with decisions and not being responsible for anyone, especially the girls, which she attempts to ship off back to their parents multiple times, despite knowing the looming threat that they could be killed if left alone at any time. To suddenly change it and masking it as character development, the character becomes a straight-up joke. Speaking of which, let's move on to the girls. We got Julia Cornwall, played by Sydney Sweeney, Anya Corazon, played by Isabel Merced, and Mattie Franklin, played by Celeste O'Connor. They're so boring as characters, and I hate their inclusion in general. In fact, I'm being nice calling them characters because they're one note in terms of personality traits and chemistry, with only an hour to develop them. To compensate for development, the characters really try to hammer home how bleak and tragic their backstories are, because apparently that is how one relates to a character, for sympathy. Luckily, this tactic is so painfully obvious that it just backfires on itself and slows the pacing to a halt. I'll say that Merced is the least bad out of the three. I know that she's been a good actor in other media, specifically her stint on Nickelodeon and Instant Family, and she does a competent job with what she's given. O'Connor also does an okay job with her role, but her arsehole shtick can be grating. As for Sweeney, yeah, I didn't like her here. You could tell that she was uncomfortable in her role and that she just didn't want to be there, and it took me out of the film a handful of times. Now, these opinions do not factor in the chemistry between one another, because in that case, it's just downright awful. None of the characters gel together, making the ending wherein they're friendly with one another just feels empty. I'll say in general that the chemistry between all actors is clearly lacking, although I believe that to be more on the fault of the director, which we'll get to later on. Now, Ezekiel Sims, played by Tahar Rahim, is quite possibly the most disappointing addition to the film, more so that the potential of his character is so wasted, a man who tries to cheat death by killing those who will kill him in the future. When you compare this to Terminator, and while I agree with the comparison, the film sort of expands upon this in giving it some new layers by having Sims envision a future rather than any form of time travel, plus having a relatable person turned insane by the thought of knowing his demise and being reminded so every night, is something so haunting and dark that deserves to be in a much better film than this. The concept is barely explored here and does nothing to make Sims redeemable or interesting. In fact, he's the opposite, in all the wrong ways. From the beginning of the film, he's just a bad guy because insert I didn't grow up with much backstory here. It's brought up at the most inopportune times, and that is all the emotional depth we get from him. What makes this worse is Raheem's performance. I mean, Tahar Rahim is a great actor, and has been in great stuff prior, but I have no clue what happened here. I think unlike Johnson, whose acting is often hit or miss in general, this may be more in the fault of the director once more, as well as the rewrites and shoddy ADR, but it doesn't excuse you turning in a terrible performance like that. Please try, man. What I can say for a positive about Ezekiel Sims is how the general look of him is badass. Why has he got no socks on? No clue, but he looks sick anyway. And the suit. I might be one of the few people here to really love Sims' suit. The dark greenish body texture blends with the redlining perfectly, the eyes being a true highlight. For a villain with spider-like powers, this is what you'd imagine. Too bad the suit is used sparingly. Surprisingly, Adam Scott is in this film, playing Ben Parker. The film is never on the nose about that, or his relation to May or Mary's soon-to-be newborn at all. Adam, you had a good thing going with Severance, why did you choose to be here? In all honesty, Scott is probably the only actor that I liked here, along with Mike Epps, but the film just never utilises him unfortunately. Ben is Cassie's paramedic partner, and also a dick. Yeah, I said I like Scott's performance, but not the character he's playing. Now up to this point, the characters I've discussed, I have little to no knowledge of their comic book depictions in general, therefore I can't comment on the accuracy of their portrayals. I mean, Ezekiel Sims is clearly different here, but the potential that the film sets up is more disappointing than not being a comic book accurate portrayal. But everyone knows the character of Uncle Ben. He's the moral compass of Peter and a generally good person. Well, not here. Sort of. Like Cassie, he's insincere in how he speaks, and one scene specifically comes to mind when I think about this point. So when a little kid gives Cassie a drawn picture of his mum getting better, Ben attempts to avoid the family entirely and almost mock them once they leave. Like, how poor of a writer must you be to make Ben Parker an unlikable person? And don't give me the he's younger bullshit. He's in his early 50s and should understand the weight of how he acts by now. And then near the end of the film, suddenly he's a good person. It's like the film never knows how to develop characters throughout the film, so they just instead develop the characters between scenes without showing that development. It's like watching two separate films at times with the characters just becoming separate entities like that. But I will say that Scott is generally trying in this role, and in a better film would be a great Ben Parker. It's a shame that the writing just fails on him here. And the final character I want to bring up is Constant Webb, played by Carrie Bish. She really isn't in the film long, and just like most characters, is just a dick, but what's interesting is how this relates to Cassie. Essentially, Cassie's only development is becoming less pissy that her mum is dead. Yeah. And it gets better. Apparently, Cassie was diagnosed with a fatal genetic disorder during pre-childbirth, so Constance was trying to do everything in her power to cure this disorder, hence going to Peru to locate a spider with healing properties. And then Cassie's happy with her mother. If you couldn't tell, this specific plot point is quite ableist. As someone who, despite not having a genetic disorder, has a disability nonetheless, I'm offended with what was written here, and it's clearly a poor excuse to bait sympathy from the audience. It's something that the writers really should be ashamed of, rather than promoting this as a positive thing to do that turned out for the better in the long run. Moving away from the actors, I want to focus on an aspect of Madam Web that a lot of people have seemingly avoided, probably because it's a name not associated with media one can use to further criticise the film. The director, which is S.J. Clarkson. Now, Clarkson has a solid resume in paper, directing episodes for acclaimed TV shows such as Dexter, Bates Motel, Succession, and more. For me, the highlight was seeing that she directed 2 episodes of Jessica Jones, which is such a great show, you all should definitely check it out. As well, she's also directed 1 TV movie, that being Toast. Already you may have noticed that she's only directed 1 film, that 1 film not even being theatrical. Well, it did later get a theatrical release, but was first made for TV. So giving a first-time director a daunting project such as this was probably not the best decision on Sony's end, and in general the direction seems invisible here. The actors apart from Scott and Epps look like they have no clue what to do and never seem to gel with one another. Scenes just drag for no reason, often to pad out the just under 2-hour runtime. Events in the film sort of just happen with a clear lack of coherency. Clarkson doesn't have a clear directing style to implement, and that would be fine as long as she knew how to direct what was being adapted competently. She didn't. The mandated reshoots and constant rewrites to the script possibly didn't help in her favour, the script in which she originally helped pen, but it was clear that she was out of her depth with Madam Web, and the fact that her directing is invisible probably helps her in the case of receiving less criticism from critics and general audiences. Not me though. But whilst the direction is invisible, the writing clearly isn't. And what did you expect with getting Morbius writers Matt Suzama and Burt Sharpless to return in full swing? Along with S.J. Clarkson first-time writer Claire Parker, it took 4 of them to produce a script, post multiple rewrites so horrendous that Sony just had to say yes, apparently. This part of the film specifically has been beaten to death, so I'll be more brief here. General dialogue between characters never seems real and more so static, often contributing to the lackluster performances. Exposition is lazily implemented at such random points that it gets jarring and can pull you out of the film. References to the early 2000s are about as typical and cookie-cutter as one would think based on the overall film's quality. And the Spider-Man references just kill me. even when considering that they removed Amazing Spider-Man references from the film, for no reason other than to seemingly connect to Tom Holland's Spider-Man timeline. It's more obvious post-reshoots. Take for instance the scene in which people are guessing the name of Mary's child. Pure infuriation. And the name Peter is never even brought up, but it's hinted at so much that I felt the film breaking me down with its stupidity. The worst aspect of the writing is how it doesn't even understand the characters it's adapting. I already mentioned Ben Parker, but it's clear that the comics would never depict these characters as one-note dickheads in the first place. I'm not even angry with the writing overall, just disappointed. Anywho, let's move on to the more technical elements of the film, say the cinematography and editing. Now, specifically with the cinematography, this is from Mauro Fior, sorry for butchering the name, an Academy Award winner cinematographer for Avatar, with other notable films including Training Day and Spider-Man No Way Home. You wouldn't think the cinematography came from someone with a high caliber of films and watching Madame Web. Also a first time cinematographer, he didn't know what the fuck they were doing. Shots constantly zoom in and out with no purpose. I assume this was done to make the film feel more grounded, like a documentary feel, but it's so out of place here, being quite unwarranted. And when half the shots are just generic and flat, it befuddles the mind more so why that specific style of filming was chosen in the first place. There are a couple of instances when shots can be kinda cool, particularly with Sims, but they're so few and far between. Luckily, the editing comes in here to make this even worse. Leigh Folsom Boyd is the editor, and whilst her back catalogue isn't as illustrious, she's still competent with her work, therefore should not be excused for some of the most jarring editing choices in recent history. Shots flash between one another without a purpose, this is a running theme here, and in some scenes it can become disorientating, difficult to even watch. I can't comprehend what happens at times due to the editing hating to stay on a shot for more than 2 seconds most of the time. Like the direction, there is a clear feeling of inexperience and lack of identity or focus, which is more of a shame since that these people have done some good or even amazing work in the past, so to just turn in a piece of work like this is disgusting to say the least. On to a slightly more positive note, we have the OST, composed by Johan Söderqvist, sorry for butchering another name, which is probably one of the few highlights of the film, and it's just fine. Like, sometimes it feels a bit out of place in that the dramatic overtones don't fully fit with the thriller vibes the film attempts to instill, but in other instances the score takes its time with the sound, a mature touch from a seasoned composer, and has some nice melodies and chord progressions, specifically Poisoned with its edgy guitar feel towards the end of the track, X-Men First Class vibes, and Box of Memories with its solemn approach to the piano. Söderqvist is a solid composer, and he is actually instilling a focus into his work that practically no one else can regarding Madame Web. The balance of thriller and superhero is well done, although it leans on the latter a little too often for the sake of emotion, which can be annoying when tracks like Box of Memories show that it can be less prominent in its strength of instrumentation, yet are more touching. As well, the score isn't too memorable. Even when watching the film, I couldn't remember how my favourite tracks sounded, more so what they did well. Re-listening, I can appreciate the sound more, and I would recommend that people check out the Madame Web OST, the only part of the film I'd recommend, for being a genuine piece of quality. Yeah, it's nothing more than okay. The score just gets more positive limelight for actually being a competent part of the film, so props to Söderqvist. The production design by Ethan Todman is another positive point. This is something I saw Kayla Say's mention in her review, which will be linked in the description, wherein a lot of the films seem to be recorded on location, unlike a lot of other superhero films. It's a praise I can agree with, to an extent. Often Madame Web feels quite grounded regarding where it's set, and makes the world feel more realised. I personally loved how Peru was shot, despite how limited its overall inclusion in the film was. Captured effortlessly in its establishing shots, one of the few times Fiora is displaying his craft effectively. More films, especially superhero films, should be striving for realism like this, so I can appreciate Madame Web for standing out in a positive respect. Unfortunately, there are too many instances which the film just falls back on cheap green screening and laughable CGI. I mean, have you seen the CGI spiders here? They're so out of place, man, with no shadow or finer details on the design for them to blend in with the rest of the film. I know the budget was only $80 million, but a film like The Creator achieved groundbreaking CGI with the same budget, and I'm not even going to go into Godzilla Minus One. To be fair, the disastrous cinematography and editing actually mask the poor green screening a lot. Not a positive, but noticing it anyway is yet another instance of me being taken out of the film. Here, just seeing the work put into the production design only to then not go all out leaves the look of the film to be jarring, or during night scenes, awkwardly inconspicuous. Up to now, it probably seems like I really hate the film compared to most. Not really, I'm just expanded upon my points of criticism, whereas their criticism is surface level. But there is a genuine element of the film that I sorta like. Cassie seeing into the future. Not really the second half of the film as much, as it's severely downplayed to focus on Cassie looking after the girls, more so the first half. The scene in which Cassie falls into the river and she's dragged across a web of future events, as if there was no sort of gravity at play, was a cool visualisation, and the shotty CGI somewhat helped with that fact. Like in some shots it's just a CG double of Johnson rather than her actually being there, but it works in forming a unique and intriguing environment. Say a scaled back rendition of the Open Your Eye scene from Doctor Strange, especially in terms of CGI quality. It's a shame that this environment is only really seen in a couple of snippets afterwards, as the imagery shown gave the film a piece of an identity that I wish was developed further. As well, there is an entire scene in this film that I believe to be quite effective in demonstrating the negative effects of Cassie's powers, probably the only good full-length scene in the film. So Cassie and Ben are called to a job in which she's needed to resuscitate a man. Whilst this occurs, she keeps getting distracted by seeing into the future, the visions themselves and sounds slowly chipping away at her psyche. One of the visions is of her actually attempting to resuscitate a dead O'Neill, Epps' character, although it's brief so we don't know the whole story there. She then tries to join O'Neill for the next task, yet Ben needs her to help out with other civilians, so Cassie walks away from O'Neill driving off in an ambulance, only to be hit by a truck. That last sentence, all shot in one take. It was the only time that I respected what was being shown, and I felt genuine sympathy for O'Neill dying, primarily due to Epps' acting rather than the writing for him. Again, it's another example of the film having a piece of an identity lost to rewrites and reshoots. If each scene had as much suspense, creative initiative, and development and concepts as this, we could have been seeing an entirely different film. So that was Madam Web, and yeah, it's a bad film. The cast, except for Scott and Epps, look out of place and have no chemistry with one another. The direction is invisible, the writing is laughable in how it adapts its source material, and the cinematography and editing just make the end product incredibly disorientating to watch. However, the score is solid, the production design, when utilised, can be quite effective for certain scenes, and there are times when the film develops and expands upon its concepts well. It's just an annoyance of mine that the potential seen in these glimpses is squandered by a disastrous execution. But that doesn't mean the film can't be salvaged. So this is the fun part of the video for me, wherein I go over what I would do to improve Madam Web to be a generally good film. In my eyes, of course. Because deep inside, there is a good film here, lost to a mountain of negative factors. First, I'm replacing Dakota Johnson. The quality of her acting in general is questionable to say the least, and I believe that having a strong actor who can pull off effective performances in media of varying quality would be better suited for this role, especially someone known for starring in darker, more relatable films. This is why I picked Alicia Vikander. From Ex Machina to The Danish Girl to The Green Knight, it's clear that Vikander is a terrific actor with layers of emotional depth to each performance, and personally is one of the most underrated actors working in the industry currently. I see her as the perfect fit for Cassie Webb, as the subtlety of the character in demonstrating her potential anxiety and PTSD with seeing into the future would be quite a demanding and difficult character to interpret. The rest of the cast I'll keep the same, for reasons I'll explain shortly. The Constance Webb and Mary Parker side plots are getting binned as they serve no true purpose to the film other than to pad out the runtime, the former as a needless character arc for Cassie, and the latter as blatantly weak fan service. Although I'm keeping Ben Parker here, again I'll explain shortly. Before going into my plot read for how Madam Web should go, I thought I'd discuss who I think should be the best choice for directing this film. Unfortunately, Ashley Clarkson just hasn't had enough experience with directing feature-length films, nor does she have the unique style that could be implemented into a film such as this, and that's why I chose Leigh Whannell. Might be an outlier choice, but I picked him for a good reason. Whannell is quite possibly most known for creating the long-running Saw franchise along James Wan, but I know him well from directing Upgrade and The Invisible Man. Only seeing the latter, it's a fantastic film and a great twist on the horror thriller genre by having the protagonist be relatable, with her struggles given room for development. It helps that the film is quite tense and makes moments such as hitting a dog bowl terrifying. I picked him because he knew how to do something new and intriguing with an IP, something I believe he could do with Madam Web by having it be a full-blown thriller, more in the vein of Unbreakable. He also wrote The Invisible Man himself, so I trust that he could turn in a great script here as well. So to start this revised version of Madam Web, we see Ezekiel Sims, played by Raheem, searching Peru for a spider with healing properties, like in the original but without Constance in the picture. Yes, I still kept him because he's a generally good actor, and Whannell would probably use him more effectively. As he finally collects a few of them, an earthquake begins to occur, affecting the livelihood of the civilians nearby. He attempts to rescue them, but is then put into an ultimatum to save a young girl or the spiders he collected thus far. The decision is that of greed, and he runs away from the site, attempting to block out the horrid action he just committed. In the present day, I'm keeping the events that occur for Cassie intact, except with improved dialogue and scene scenarios, particularly with Ben, who is now sort of a moral compass for Cassie. Since that he's younger than the counterparts we're normally accustomed to, he's not completely confident in his own device, often believing that he isn't making a difference just yet. That's where the bond between the two comes in. Despite Cassie's more reckless nature, she understands what Ben expects of her, therefore striving to be a competent person herself, to mixed results. Rather than reintroduce Sims by him seducing an NSA agent, I think it'd be more interesting seeing him getting murdered by the girls in his nightmare, waking up and looking tired of the visions he faces each night. Show don't tell. Also, a couple of scenes running his company because he is a successful businessman, remember? Being suave and relaxed would help develop a contrast into the man Sims becomes. Perhaps his company specialises in healing the human body via breeding the spiders he collected from Peru, yet in only minute doses so that others do not bear the powers and torment he carries each day. Side note on the girls, I'm not having them as the superheroines that Aliyah billed as in the original, based on events that occur later on, plus their implementations early would be less on the nose. So in the scene which Cassie is helping a man who is trapped in a suspended car, rather than having the car fall into the ocean as soon as Ben pulls the man out, the car falls when Cassie thrusts herself back on instinct when bitten by a spider, the one from Sim's company. Must have escaped. I am keeping a scene where Cassie begins to gain her powers before being rescued by Ben because it's a cool visualization and should be in the film more often in general. Except Ben is more sincere here because he isn't a dickhead sharpless in Shazama. Sims, restless and beyond sanity from his nightmares, begins to build a suit to disguise himself, wherein he stalks the streets of New York at night to kill those 3 girls. Rather than reveal his plan, seeing his facial reactions and breakdown of mental stability would be a more unique look into his PTSD. Cassie is also struggling with PTSD once given her powers to see into the future, wherein she can't seem to concentrate as the sound and sights around her blur into a mesh of broken realities. This would be where both the sound design and visual effects can become more creative in representing Cassie's perception of reality. This comes to a head with the scene in which O'Neill is sadly killed. Yes, I'm keeping that scene as well because it's generally good and would fit well here. Building off this with a scene or two where Cassie is attempting to calm herself down and comprehend the powers she possesses would give her a relatable perception rather than the audience feeling disconnected, like we are to Johnson's Cassie. Now we're at the scene at Grand Central Station, wherein all the primary characters meet each other. I want the scene to stay mostly intact, except for when Sims finally meets the girls. He murders them. Yes, in this version of the film the girls die, hence why they're just normal people. I didn't want to kill off popular characters pre-superpowers. The brutality in which Sims kills each of them would be raw, akin to how the Invisible Man attacks his prey, and Cassie is just watching. She can't breathe, and the visions she endures are so difficult to comprehend in the moment that she faints on the spot. No score would be present to further amplify the horror which Sims is committing in his actions. Once the deed is done, he leaves Cassie in an unconscious state, completing what he set out to do. Now you probably wonder why we just kill off the girls like that. Simply, it allows for stronger story potential with the characters of Cassie and Ezekiel, both in how they react to the situation in the short and long term, and how they attempt to live a normal life once more. For Cassie, she's now placed on a sabbatical, on her own accord. The burden she carries from Grand Central Station is too severe to ignore. Seeing her take responsibility for her mental health would be a mature development in Cassie's character, since previously, you'd think that she would die for her job first. This would be where Ben's role in the film becomes more clear, visiting Cassie on his breaks to ensure that she is doing well and regaining normality in her life. It'd be hinted that he might know Cassie has powers, but another perception could be that he doesn't know, yet the advice he gives to Cassie regarding the moral obligation to do good is so personal, she sees it as the former. Also, I ain't having a "with great power comes great responsibility" speech here, as it's quite bare bones in retrospect. All you need is an adult conversation about what it takes to be a good person, along with the sacrifices needed. With how the rest of her arc would go, I'd have her utilise her visions of the future for good, yet with a twist. As opposed to someone like Spider-Man who fights evil for the sake of good, Cassie sees the difference she can make to people in general, on a small scale, believing it to be a calling in life, along with her job as a paramedic. Realising this, she begins to heal from the emotional trauma. For Sims, it's more bleak. He realises that killing those girls did nothing for his happiness, instead driving him further into insanity with the heinous act committed. He becomes a recluse, barely being able to run his company. Little to no speech ever leaving his mouth, save for constant mutters of regret. His body parts individually shake, out of his control, and his psyche can never rest. Whereas in the film where Sims was only a bad person with a clear lack of redeemable traits, this approach would, whilst making him relatable, give him a redemptive arc that explores the effects of killing a person. These two characters would converge in the final 15 minutes. Since her vision of Sims falling off the Queensboro Bridge, Cassie believes she's ready to return to her job. The power she possesses an additional part of her that can be used for additional good. Unfortunately, she becomes static upon arriving on the job, seeing that Sims is about to jump. The trauma floods back, yet she controls it and realises that they need to speak one-on-one to truly move on. Cassie and Sims have a private conversation together lasting a little over 5 minutes. Sims is guilt-ridden of what he did and understands he can't beg for repentance anymore. He believes that one less evil person in the world would be a better place. Cassie attempts to express that he can still redeem himself by using his expansive powers for good, yet Sims has made his decision on his life already, and states that this would allow Cassie to finally move on. He gives her a minute smile before jumping, the weight of his actions lifted from his face. Redemption. The film would end sometime later, with Cassie continuing to use her visions of the future for good, coming to terms with her emotional trauma and has progressed as a person. no sequel baiting, no twist ending, just a character completing their arc. I know that I complained about the original film not adapting its source material well when I sort of did my own thing too, but that was because I wanted to expand upon the few elements that were interesting to produce a unique concept I would want to watch. Going all in for the suspense thriller feel was a must, along with a darker tone for the sake of more believable and mature characters. Yet it technically is a superhero film, but one more so focused on how our actions affect those around us rather than fighting for the sake of good. Again, similarly to Unbreakable. Plus, making Uncle Ben a moral compass to Cassie was a justifiable reason to include his character, rather than having a knockoff version just being a dickhead until he wasn't. It was quite enjoyable thinking of concepts and expanded upon them regarding how I would approach a film such as Madam Web. Of course, you all probably have your own ideas for something such as this, so comment down below how you would want to make a Madam Web film. Christ, I rambled on for a long time, didn't I? In retrospect, it still feels like I missed out a lot of analysis for Madam Web, but it's not like I can talk about each individual detail, I'd be here all day. Again with the Madam Web reviews, I didn't want to hate on them as they represent opinions from individuals I respect. It's just that they are not expanded upon, leaving the content for a film like this to be quite similar. I hope what I said not only resonated with you all, but also gave a more comprehensive explanation for why Madam Web is a bad film, as well as what I do to fix it. Obviously, a video like this is quite random on my channel, but I wanted to make it nonetheless as I was passionate in releasing a unique perception on the film. In all honesty, there are some reviews that are different from what most are releasing, so I'll have those linked in the description below. If you all enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like as well as subscribing, that'd be nice. I am interested to hear everyone's thoughts on the film, especially if they're more detailed than what most are outputting, so comment down below your consensus. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.